And the next file is the validation.js file. Here I also want to write some tests, hence I'll add a validation.test.js file. And in there we then also want to define some tests. I won't add a suite here because in this file I only have one function. We could of course still add a suite if we want to structure our test output a bit better, but here I'll not do it. And then the first thing I want to test is that this function, which I do want to test, this validation function here, should throw an error if an empty string is provided. So it should throw an error if an empty string is provided as a value. That's the first test I want to write. And for this, I have my test input, which is just an empty string, of course. And then my validation function, which is in the end just a wrapper around calling validate.not_empty, which therefore, of course, must be imported. And to validate.not_empty, we pass the test input. And I'm putting it into this anonymous function which wraps this call to validate.not_empty, because that's a pattern you learned about earlier in the course that can be used for testing for errors, because now we can import expect from vtest here, and then expect the validation function, which will then be executed by vtest, not by us, to throw. And if I only care about an error being thrown, and I don't care about which type of error it is or which error message it contains, this is all I have to do. With that, if we now run npm test, this works and this also passes. Now that's the first test. I also want to make sure that it does not just throw an error for an empty string, but also for a string that only consists of blanks. For this, we can add a couple of blanks here. The exact number doesn't matter. You can also just use one blank if you want to. I'm just using 2 here so that it's immediately obvious that there is a blank here between the quotes. And with that, the rest of the test can stay the way it is, but now it should also throw an error if a non-empty string is provided, if that string only consists of blanks, which is technically not empty, but of course also not useful. And indeed, if I run npm test, this still passes. And in validation.js, if we would remove this check, for example, which is responsible for getting rid of those extra blanks, the test would not pass anymore. Now it would fail. So now we detect breaking changes like this one, which should not be made to the code. At least if we want to have the behavior of treating strings full of blanks as empty. Now, one last test which I want to write here is that it should throw an error with the provided error message if an error is thrown. Because it turns out that to this validate.not_empty function, we can pass an error message that should be thrown, and I want to test whether that is really the case. And again, achieving this is quite straightforward. We can copy the code from the first test again to force an error because we pass an empty string. And then we call validate.not_empty not just with this input, but also with a test error message, which again could be test. And it's this test error message which I pass as a second argument to validate.not_empty. And now we can verify that it's not just any error that's thrown, but an error with this message by passing test error message to throw, because as you learned earlier in the course, to throw accepts a message or a regular expression to check for parts of the message, so that it verifies that it's not just any error, but an error with that message instead. With that, if we now save this and we run npm test, it works because our error message is used. And again, if we would change the code in there to throw an error with a generic message like should not be empty, then we would quickly catch this change because our test would fail. And of course here I'm going to revert it, therefore, so that all tests pass again. Now that was the repetition. Now let's move on to the new parts, or to the parts where we again dive into mocking.